We may have heard this phrase, first get your own house in order before talking about other people's business. That may then come in the form of, oh, he's such a hothead. Oh, he pretends to care about others, but yet he's so angry and so disrespectful toward those he's trying to help or comment upon. Or a certain level of cynicism, you might say. What is his ulterior motive? I think an overall view of that might be, wait until you're perfect before doing something. That then would come under the rubric of being a perfectionist, wouldn't it? In fact, in a video about the Buddhist man, Thich Nhat Hanh, it was commented upon that some in Southeast Asia, in monasteries who had wanted to help concerning the Vietnam War there, in that region, some advising them to stay until they had completed their training in the monastery, and then they would make much more impact. But some not wanting to wait. Again, the concept, should we wait till almost perfect in terms of level of anger, level of understanding, level of acceptance, and our words, how refined they are, how respectful before acting, before saying anything, lest we again be said to have been a hothead or a fool, a hypocrite, that we should first get our house in order before speaking about anything in anyone else's life. Well, if we were to follow the adage, get your house in order first yourself, then I think we would not have had the following people, and this is just probably a small example, in the world. Take Abraham Lincoln. Surprisingly, I had read yesterday in a book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that Abe Lincoln in his younger days used to distribute materials anonymously about certain aspects of certain people that one individual in particular felt so inflamed about, so injured his pride, I would say because of a misuse of certain words that were then felt to be insulting, that Abe Lincoln was challenged to a duel, and it almost was carried out. Abe Lincoln, in fact, having acquired the help of a West Point graduate or student, one of the two, to train him in how to duel with swords, because his arms too were long. So, at any rate, if Abe Lincoln had said, well, I'm just going to sit tight and say nothing and do my own thing and make a pile of money or do whatever floats my boat and not care about people, not say a word, we would have no Abe Lincoln, right? Another man, Gandhi, thrown off the train for not wanting to get out of his seat when it was said he was in the wrong compartment with the wrong ticket. Some would say he was a hothead earlier in life. If you looked at how he dressed, how he comported himself, photographs of himself, far less compassionate, you would say, far less understanding. A hothead, you might say, Gandhi was earlier in life. Are we to say he should not have gotten off that train or stayed in the compartment and been kicked out then that he was in, until he was perfected and then done that? Yet another example, Nelson Mandela. He was quite the, quote, activist, starting off earlier in his life, arrested. At one point, well, just how respectful was he compared to later in life, when he talked outside of prison of the importance of humility, amongst other things. I don't suppose he was, quote, quite that humble early in life. How much of a component then was that in his being arrested, rather than not otherwise? Was he, too, then, a third example I'm bringing up of a hothead? What if he hadn't done activities of what he had done, protesting and more, because he felt he was a hothead and he was waiting to perfect himself? How long was he supposed to wait until no longer the so-called hothead, the person a master of vocabulary, patience, humility, etc.? And this could go on and on then. Our great leaders often, you might say, were hotheads earlier in life. Some would say even grandiose. And yet you have to start somewhere, right? Perhaps a big problem being having great empathy from how you were raised, but not the words to match when discussing things. And in my mind then, that a big crux of the matter. And coming off then as a, quote, hothead, due largely to a lack of proper vocabulary, which can take a whole lifetime to craft, rather than just take off the shelf as is that societies hand us. But to say no one should take a start in life and act upon their empathy of high order because they lack the proper vocabulary to match. Well, when are they supposed to act? If they wait long, perhaps they will become jaded and give up, be, quote, depressed, or, quote, join the other side, as in Star Wars movies, or the simple phrase, if you can't beat them, join them. Or in psychiatric terminology, identification with the aggressor, meaning thus, if you can't beat your aggressor, why not join them against someone else, say in your own family? I'll close with a thought, something I heard a couple years ago by a former minister from the Caribbean, Miles Monroe, M-Y-L-E-S, very famous in certain circles throughout the world. He said, how can you tell what your gift is? It's what you get angry about, what angers you. Well, I would probably say, to qualify this now, at my point in time, a few years later, having once viewed him for the first time, what angers you earlier in life, perhaps not necessarily and hopefully later in life. In other words, what is your gift? It's what makes you a hothead earlier in life and hopefully not later in life, as you gain what they call wisdom, patience, the optimal words for the optimal level of respect and admiration and love given back to you. I love the phrase, for instance, I heard once by Wayne Dyer. If you don't have love to give, you're not going to get back love, or words to that effect. But in part, that might also be, if you don't have the proper words to go along with your love, your empathy of high level, it's going to be hard to get back due consideration. Earlier in life, that is, I would say. Unless, of course, you try to act on the behalf of raising the betterment of mankind, and then you just plain give up. One final example. If it weren't for these so-called, sometimes hotheads, involved in Mothers Against Drunk Driving, notice that even the word drunk implies a certain manner of inappropriate words sometimes. Who wants to be called a drunk, no matter what the impact upon others to be? The phrase not being Mothers Against Inebriated Drivers. Were they supposed to wait until a point in time when they were Gandhi's in terms of his older age, gleaming with compassion and joy and smiles? Were they supposed to wait until they could phrase their movement, mothers against inebriated drivers instead of drunk drivers? Were they supposed to be serene saints before they acted? And finally, what were some of the people 20, 30, 40 years later as opposed to when they first started the movement or joined in? If they had waited until they were no longer considered, quote, hotheads by anybody, how many more people would be driving today inebriated as opposed to the case now? You might say then, thank goodness for the positive effects of the so-called hotheads in the world, especially if they persist to the point they become much more aware of their vocabulary's impact, or in general, much more respectful, much more empathetic in that manner as per how things come across, not just overall empathy. Thank goodness, perhaps, then, for the so-called hotheads, the so-called axe grinders. For without them, maybe we would not have had Lincoln, Gandhi, and many, many others. Certain key presidents, certain key religious figures, Nelson Mandela, what have you. Of course, we hope the hotheads grow, so to speak, the persons of high empathy, oftentimes who lack words to match. But in time, the words grow in stature, shall we say, in respect level, and thus in overall impact. But thank goodness perhaps for the hotheads of the world, as long as it isn't just clearly sheer maliciousness, of course. Now that then is a different matter, perhaps to some extent, but who's to draw the line here? Who's to define it? Food for thought.